I want you to picture something for a second. Think about a plastic bottle you recently finished. Maybe it was sparkling water or maybe soda.
Right, just an everyday piece of trash.
Exactly. You finished it, you walked over to the bins in your kitchen or your office, and you made a deliberate choice. You bypassed the regular trash can and you dropped it right into the recycling bin.
And you probably felt pretty good about it.
You do. You hear that satisfying hollow thud. You get that tiny, momentary ping of satisfaction. You did the right thing.
You follow the rules.
Yeah. But here is the question we are asking today. What if the mathematical reality of the global economy means that your bottle still ends up in a landfill? Or, an ocean?
And crucially, what if it's not because of a lack of sorting technology?
Right. What if it's not the physical infrastructure that's broken, but because the underlying incentives of every single person handling that bottle down the line just fundamentally do not align?
It's a question that completely forces us to reframe the entire conversation around waste. I mean, we've spent decades treating recycling as just a physical logistics problem.
Like if we just build a better machine, it'll all work out.
Exactly. The assumption has always been that if we engineer a smarter sorting machine or put the right colored bin on the right street corner, the system will naturally optimize itself. We look at the physical flow of polymers and metals.
But that's missing the human element.
Entirely. What we are really looking at when we trace that bottle is a vast, invisible web of human decisions. If the economic and social rules governing those sequential decisions are broken, the physical infrastructure is largely irrelevant.
Because the material is always going to flow toward the path of least resistance.
Always.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a massive stack of sources today to map out that path of least resistance. We have ethnographic field notes, supply chain audits, government policy analyses.
It's a really diverse set of materials.
It is, and it's all anchored by this groundbreaking 2026 paper by independent researcher Paul Pajo. It introduces a concept called the Circular Kahampitan Index.
Or the CKI for short.
The CKI, right. And I have to be totally honest with you, when I first started digging into this material, my head was just spinning.
It gets dense very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to be blending hardcore algorithmic game theory, computational complexity, quantum computing horizons, and indigenous philosophy, all to try and solve what Pajo calls the diagnostic gap in global sustainability.
And that synthesis of those seemingly disparate fields is exactly what makes this research so compelling. I mean, we are moving from the abstract theoretical world of algorithmic game theory,
where everyone is just a node on a graph.
right, specifically looking at how decentralized self-interested behavior undermines the collective good. But then we are taking that math straight into the hyper-practical, bustling informal economies of the Philippines.
We're tracing the math all the way down to the cultural understanding of human well-being. It's fascinating.
The core mission here is to understand the hidden forces that dictate where our materials actually go and why our current economic frameworks are failing us despite, massive investments in sustainability.
So let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at the current state of the global economy, which is, overwhelmingly stuck in a linear model.
The classic take, make, and dispose pipeline.
Exactly. We extract virgin resources, we manufacture a product, we consume it, and we throw it away. Now, for years, the proposed alternative has been the circular economy.
Where materials continuously cycle through the system, they retain their value.
Right. But this paper argues that our ability to actually transition to a circular economy is being massively hampered by the very metrics we use to measure our progress.
Well, if you want to change a complex system, your intervention is only as good as your measurement tool. And the research highlights that our existing tools have profound structural blind spots.
They're measuring the wrong things.
Or rather, they are fundamentally descriptive rather than diagnostic. The paper specifically examines two of the most prominent metrics used globally right now.
Let's start with the first one, the MCI.
Yes, the Material Circularity Indicator developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. It is incredibly popular in corporate sustainability reports, but the MCI is deeply, almost exclusively, focused on the product level.
Right. It looks at a single item in total isolation. So, like, if I'm a clothing manufacturer and I design a new rain jacket,
The MCI looks at your inputs.
yeah, it looks at how much virgin nylon I use versus recycled polyester.
Uh-huh.
It looks at whether I used reversible zippers so the jacket can be taken apart later.
And the theoretical lifespan of the garment itself.
Exactly. And then it gives you a score from 0 to 100% for that specific physical product based entirely on its design.
But here's the problem. It evaluates the product's potential, assuming a fictionless world. It basically operates in an economic vacuum.
Right, because once I sell that jacket, it enters the real world.
It enters a chaotic, friction-filled global supply chain. The MCI completely ignores network effects, power dynamics, and the strategic human interactions required to actually recover that jacket at the end of its life.
So a company could design a product with a perfect 100% MCI score. They can put it on their website and brag about it.
They do it all the time. But if the local waste picker, or the regional aggregator, or the municipal sorting facility doesn't have a clear, immediate economic incentive to actually pick it up and recover it,
That perfect jacket goes straight into an incinerator.
or a landfill, the MCI tells us what the product is made of, but it fails entirely to explain why the system refuses to capture it.
Wow. Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum. But then on the complete opposite end, we have metrics like the circular material use rate.
The CMU, published by Eurostat.
Right, the CMU. And instead of looking at a single jacket, the CMU takes this massive macroeconomic national level view.
It calculates the total share of material recovered and fed back into the economy of an entire country.
So a nation might release a report boasting, CMU of 12%, and everyone pats themselves on the back.
But the CMU is a massive aggregate percentage. While it's helpful for, say, international comparisons, an aggregate number of 12% can easily mask catastrophic regional inefficiencies.
Like what? What gets hidden in there?
Well, it might hide the fact that certain vital materials like rare earth metals are being lost entirely, while heavy, low-value materials like construction aggregate are artificially inflating the recovery percentage.
Oh, because concrete weighs so much more than microchips.
Exactly. But more importantly, just like the MCI, the CMU is entirely descriptive. It tells a government what is happening at a macro level, but it is fundamentally non-diagnostic.
It doesn't tell you the why.
Exactly. It offers absolutely no insight into the behavioral drivers, the market failures, or the human incentives that are generating that 12% in the first place.
It sounds to me like the MCI and the CMU are basically thermometers. They're useful, sure. If the thermometer reads 102 degrees, it tells us the patient has a fever.
It tells us our economy is wasting too much material.
Right. But a thermometer can't tell you if the fever is caused by a bacterial infection or a virus or, heat exhaustion. It just registers the heat.
That's a great analogy.
What Pajot is arguing in this paper is that the global economy desperately needs an MRI. We need a diagnostic tool that can map the internal structures, the blockages, the hidden forces that are actively routing materials to landfills when they physically could be recycled.
And getting that MRI requires a massive shift in perspective. To build that diagnostic tool, the research argues we have to stop looking purely at the physical flow of the trash itself.
We have to look at the people.
We have to look at the mathematical incentives governing the human beings interacting with that trash. We have to map the entire decision-making architecture.
And this brings us right to the core of the paper, the introduction of the Circular Kahompen Index, the CKI.
This is the MRI.
Yeah, this index attempts to quantify the exact degree of alignment or misalignment between individual economic rationality and the collective goal of circularity.
And it produces a scalar metric, a single number ranging from 0 to 1.
But to understand the mechanics of how we actually arrive at that number, we have to pull from game theory. We have to look at how humans behave when they are trapped in a system with competing interests.
Right. The entire CKI framework rests on the tension between two foundational concepts in algorithmic game theory, the Nash equilibrium and the social optimum.
Okay, let's define the Nash equilibrium first. It's named after John Nash, right?
Correct. Imagine a vast network of independent actors. This could be municipal waste managers, informal street pickers, junk shop owners, corporate recyclers.
Just everyone involved in the chain?
Right. A Nash equilibrium describes a state where every single actor in that network is making a decentralized, self-interested choice that minimizes their own personal cost.
Assuming that the choices of everyone else in the network stay exactly the same.
Exactly. It is a state of competitive gridlock. No one is communicating with the broader network, and absolutely no one is sacrificing their own bottom line for the greater good.
Right. So I look at the options in front of me. I assume you're going to keep doing what you're doing, and I just pick the cheapest, most efficient route for myself.
And if everyone does this simultaneously, a pure strategy Nash equilibrium means we reach a point of stagnation.
A point where no single person can unilaterally change their strategy to get a better deal for themselves. We're all just locked into a pattern of behavior dictated entirely by our localized self-interest.
The network basically crystallizes around those selfish choices. Now, contrast that gridlock with the concept of a social optimum.
This is the ideal scenario.
It is. The social optimum imagines a scenario where a perfectly coordinated, omniscient central planner looks at the entire supply chain from above.
Like a God's eye view of the trash.
Basically. And this planner makes choices that minimize the total aggregate cost for society as a whole. Crucially, this planner factors in collective externalities.
What do you mean by externalities in this context?
Well, they don't just look at the private gate fee of dumping at a landfill. They factor in the environmental damage of plastic leaking into a watershed. They factor in the carbon emissions from manufacturing virgin replacements.
The long-term depletion of natural capital.
Exactly. The planner asks, what configuration of material flows results in the absolute lowest possible cost for everyone combined?
But in reality, outside of some strictly planned autocratic system, we never have that omniscient planner. The global economy is just this massive collection of decentralized, selfish actors,
We are living inside the Nash equilibrium.
dealing with the fallout of everyone looking out for number one while desperately hoping to somehow reach the social optimum.
And the CKI measures the distance between those two realities. It uses a concept called the price of anarchy.
The price of anarchy, that is such a dramatic term. What is it mathematically?
It's a brilliant mechanism for quantifying dysfunction. In algorithmic game theory, the price of anarchy, or POA, is calculated by taking the total system cost of the worst-case Nash equilibrium and dividing it by the total system cost of the social optimum.
So it's a ratio.
Yes, and the resulting ratio represents the worst-case penalty a system pays simply for lacking a central coordinator. It is the quantifiable cost of our decentralized selfishness.
Okay, let's ground that in some numbers for the listener. So if the omniscient planner's social optimum costs society, say, $100 to manage a ton of waste,
Okay.
but our uncoordinated, selfish Nash equilibrium ends up costing society $150 to manage that exact same ton of waste. The price of anarchy is 1.5.
Exactly. We are paying a 50% penalty and invisible tax just for operating in a state of anarchy.
And because the selfish routing of a Nash equilibrium can never logically be cheaper for the whole system than the perfectly optimized routing of a central planner, the price of anarchy is always going to be 1.0 or higher.
That is the exact mathematical relationship. But remember, the ZKI is designed to be an alignment score from 0 to 1. It acts as a coefficient of efficiency.
So how do we get from 1.5 down to a decimal?
The model simply inverts the ratio. The primary metric, CKI line, is defined as 1 divided by the price of anarchy.
Okay, so in my example of the $150 Nash equilibrium versus the $100 social optimum, 1 divided by 1.5 gives us roughly 0.66.
Right. And a CKI score of 0.66 means that the supply chain is retaining about 66% of its optimal efficiency.
Which means the structure of the market is forcing 34% of the potential value to just bleed out through misaligned incentives.
Exactly. If the CKI score is a perfect 1.0, it means perfect alignment. It means the self-interested, decentralized choices of the actors magically result in the absolute best outcome for society.
Which probably never happens.
Rarely. And if the score plunges closer to 0, it indicates massive structural misalignment. It means rational individual choices are actively destroying the collective good.
Using the price of anarchy really exposes the friction in the system. But wait, I need to push back on the fundamental premise of this baseline equation.
Go ahead.
The price of anarchy assumes that every single actor, whether they are a corporate executive in Geneva or a street-level waste picker in Jakarta, is acting as a perfectly rational, cost-minimizing machine calculating their exact utility function.
It does assume that.
But human beings are notoriously irrational. I mean, we operate out of habit, we make decisions when we are exhausted, we act out of spite, or we just lack the necessary information to know what the cheapest option actually is.
That's entirely true.
So if the baseline assumes perfect robotic rationality, doesn't that blow a hole in the real-world applicability of the model?
The assumption of perfect rationality is a deliberate idealization, and the research actually explicitly wrestles with this limitation. Economists refer to real-world human behavior as operating under bounded rationality.
Because our rationality has limits.
Right. We have limited time, We have limited cognitive processing power, and we rarely have perfect information about market prices. The paper addresses this by noting that future, more granular iterations of the CKI model can incorporate a concept called quantum response equilibrium.
Quantum response equilibrium, that sounds like we are drifting into physics now.
It actually does borrow heavily from statistical mechanics. In game theory, a quantum response equilibrium introduces a specific noise parameter into the mathematical modeling of human decision-making.
What does that noise represent?
It acknowledges that while actors generally trend toward picking the better, cheaper option, the probability of them making a suboptimal choice increases as the difference in cost between the two options shrinks.
Ah, okay, so it mathematically accounts for confusion or deeply ingrained habits or just missing data. It softens the robotic assumption of the pure Nash equilibrium.
Exactly. It maps the human margin of error.
So, like, if option A is $10,000 cheaper than option B, everyone picks A.
The noise is minimal there.
Right. But if option A is only 2 cents cheaper, the quantum response equilibrium predicts a lot of people will just stick with option B because it's what they did yesterday and they just can't be bothered to switch.
Precisely the mechanism. However, for the foundational model presented in this initial 2026 paper, the author sticks to the pure strategy Nash equilibrium.
Why not include the noise from the start?
Because you have to establish the absolute worst-case baseline of the system's structural architecture first.
Yeah.
Before you map the human noise, you have to diagnose whether the underlying economic architecture is fundamentally broken.
You have to measure the structural misalignment before adding layers of behavioral complexity. Okay, that makes sense. We establish the rigid baseline first.
Right.
So if we assume these actors are acting rationally to minimize their private costs, we have to look closely at what those costs actually are. Like, what specific financial or logistical pressures drive someone to abandon the circular route and just toss valuable material into a landfill?
To map those pressures, the paper breaks down the vast complexity of a supply chain into a highly stylized binary choice for every single actor holding a piece of material.
Just 2 options.
Exactly. Whenever an actor holds material, they can choose route 0, which is the linear route, or route 1, which is the circular route.
Let's examine route 0 first.
Okay. If an actor chooses to dump the material, taking the linear path, they pay a private gate fee.
The immediate out-of-pocket financial costs.
Right. It could be a tipping fee at a municipal landfill, the cost of gas to drive to a dump site, or the fee paid to a private waste hauler. But this choice also generates a collective leakage externality.
And the leakage externality is the true cost to the planet. It's the microplastics leaching into the groundwater, the methane off-gassing from the landfill, the carbon emitted to drill for new oil to make replacement plastic.
Yes, all of that. But the critical flaw in the system is that the selfish actor choosing route 0 does not pay that massive externality.
Society pays it. The cost is diffused across the global population.
Exactly. The private cost of route 0 is kept artificially low for the individual, precisely because the catastrophic long-term costs are socialized.
Which makes it incredibly tempting to just dump it.
Right. Now we contrast that with route 1, the circular route. If an actor decides to recover, sort, or recycle the material, they bypass that gate fee.
But they don't get off scot-free.
No, they incur 2 very different types of burdens. The first is categorized as a private trust cost, and the second is a congestion penalty.
Okay, the concept of the trust cost feels to me like the absolute linchpin of this entire theory. We usually think of recycling costs as purely mechanical, like buying a shredder or a melting furnace.
But trust costs are entirely relational.
Yes. If I am an informal waste picker, I might not have a formalized contract with the junk shop down the street. So my trust cost is the grueling physical exhaustion of manually sorting mixed plastics for 3 hours just to meet the shop's specific standards.
Combined with the psychological friction of knowing the shop owner might arbitrarily claim your plastics are contaminated just to dock your pay.
Exactly. The friction of the transaction is often higher than the physical cost of the labor.
Trust costs encompass a massive array of inefficiencies. It is the overhead of quality assurance. It's the time spent haggling over prices in a volatile market.
Or the inherent risk of dealing with an unreliable counterparty. What if they default on a payment?
Or the reality of waiting weeks for an invoice to clear when you need cash today to feed your family. In environments lacking strong, rapid, and transparent legal frameworks to enforce contracts, the sheer effort required to verify the integrity of the material and the integrity of the buyer acts as a massive economic anchor.
And crucially, in this model, this trust cost is a private burden borne entirely by the individual actor trying to do the right thing.
Society doesn't subsidize it.
No, society doesn't subsidize the 3 hours the waste picker spends sorting. The picker eats that cost entirely. Now, layer on top of that the second factor of Route 1, the congestion penalty.
The congestion penalty incorporates the reality of physical limitations. The model assumes that as more and more actors attempt to use the circular route, the per-unit handling costs inevitably rise.
Why? Wouldn't economies of scale kick in?
Eventually, perhaps, but not in the immediate constrained reality of most recovery networks. If an entire district suddenly attempts to sell their recovered corrugated cardboard to the single local material recovery facility, the facility is overwhelmed. Processing bottlenecks emerge.
Right, trucks idling in long lines outside the gates, burning fuel.
The facility has to rent overflow storage space, increasing their overhead. And what do? They pass that cost down by lowering the price they pay for the cardboard.
So the private cost to each actor trying to recycle goes up simply because too many people are trying to do it at once.
Exactly.
You know, if we synthesize this for a moment for you listening, choosing Route 1, the circular route, is like deciding to take a scenic, environmentally friendly highway. It promises to be beautiful, and it's objectively better for the world.
But the physical road is littered with massive axle-breaking potholes.
Yes, those potholes are the trust costs, the manual verification, the risk of getting scammed. And because the infrastructure is underdeveloped, it's just a two-lane road experiencing bumper-to-bumper traffic.
Which is the congestion penalty.
It is a stressful, financially risky, miserable drive. The incentives actively punish the driver for making the environmentally sound choice.
While Route 0, the linear route, is a massive multi-lane toll road. It's a guaranteed, perfectly smooth ride.
You pay your toll, the private gate fee, and you get home fast. Now, that toll road happens to be tearing through a protected nature reserve, polluting the local watershed, and destroying the ecosystem.
The leakage externality.
Right. But for the individual driver who just finished a 12-hour shift and simply wants to get home, the toll road is the deeply rational, economically superior choice.
And the CKI is a mathematical tool designed to measure exactly how many drivers choose the destructive toll road, specifically because the scenic highway of circularity is too broken, too risky, and too congested to navigate.
The model isolates those precise incentives. It basically proves mathematically that public awareness campaigns urging people to take the scenic highway will always fail if we refuse to pave the potholes of trust and expand the lanes of processing capacity.
Now, simulating this traffic jam, calculating the intersection of trust costs and congestion to find the Nash equilibrium for 3 or 4 drivers on a theoretical highway, that is trivial.
You could do it on a napkin.
You can map out the game theory matrix on a chalkboard. But when you attempt to scale that simulation up to an entire global supply chain, or even just the waste management network of a single metropolis like Manila or Jakarta,
It really happens.
you run headfirst into a catastrophic computational wall. The math breaks down in a way that challenges our current limits of classical computing.
We really need to explore that computational wall because the paper wades deep into computational complexity theory here. Pajot points out that finding a Nash equilibrium in a generalized game is classified as PPD complete. Furthermore, calculating the price of anarchy from multi-commodity flows, where you have paper, glass, and different grades of plastic all interacting in the same network, is classified as PS space hard.
Right.
For those of us who don't have a background in advanced computer science, what do those intimidating acronyms actually mean for our ability to solve this problem?
In the taxonomy of computational complexity, PPD complete and P space hard designate classes of problems where the difficulty scales exponentially, and eventually astronomically, as you add more variables.
So it's not just hard.
It means the problem is considered intractably hard for classical computer architecture. To visualize why, the paper provides a concrete example. Imagine a highly simplified, tightly constrained theoretical network of just 50 independent actors.
Just 50 people making a yes or no choice, Route 0 or Route 1. That sounds incredibly simple.
It does. But to find the exact, definitive Nash equilibrium by brute force calculation, the computer would have to evaluate the systemic cost of every single possible combination of choices those 50 people could make.
Just to make sure no one could unilaterally improve their position.
Exactly. And that creates 2 to the power of 49 possible strategy profiles.
I'm trying to comprehend 2 to the 49th power. That's like trying to calculate every single possible sequence of moves in a chess game where the board just keeps magically expanding.
It equates to roughly 562 trillion possible configurations
Wow.
for an interconnected network of just 50 people. If a researcher wanted to model the actual waste ecosystem of a mid-sized city containing 10,000 actors, a classical supercomputer evaluating millions of profiles a second would theoretically be crunching numbers until the heat death of the universe.
It's a combinatorial explosion.
The sheer volume of intersecting choices completely overwhelms the memory and processing limits of silicon chips.
So we are dealing with a diagnostic tool that is mathematically elegant but seemingly impossible to actually compute in the real world. How does the author bypass this? Does he just abandon the calculation for large networks?
No, the author identifies a very specific, highly clever mathematical shortcut. He formalizes it in the paper as Theorem 1, the aggregative reduction.
The aggregative reduction.
Yes. He recognized that if you constrain the parameters of the model in a very particular way, you can collapse that exponential search time down to polynomial time.
Meaning the difficulty scales at a manageable rate, allowing standard computers to solve it.
Precisely.
So what is the constraint? How do you cheat the combinatorial explosion of 562 trillion combinations?
You must structure the game so that it is strictly aggregative. In an aggregative game, an individual actor's personal cost does not depend on exactly who in the network is choosing the circular route.
It only depends on the total number of people doing it.
Exactly. It only depends on the total aggregate number of people choosing it. Let us define that total number of circular adopters as the variable k.
Okay, so if I am an independent waste picker deciding whether to haul my cardboard to the recycling center, I don't care if it's Bob from the north side or Alice from the south side who is also recycling today.
Their specific identities are totally irrelevant to your math.
I just care that there are 500 total people trying to recycle today because that aggregate K of 500 dictates exactly how bad the congestion penalty is going to be at the loading dock.
Exactly. When the cost function depends solely on your own strategy and that single scalar count k, the underlying math collapses beautifully.
So instead of a computer needing to check 562 trillion specific combinations of who is doing what,
The algorithm only has to check the possible values of k from 0 adopters up to the total number of actors in the system. It transforms an impossible universe-spanning search into a relatively simple sorting exercise.
it just lines everyone up.
Yes. The algorithm simply lines up the actors based on who has the lowest individual threshold, the lowest trust costs for jumping to the circular route. And it slides down that line until it finds the equilibrium point where the rising congestion penalty perfectly offsets the benefit for the next person in line.
That is an incredibly elegant workaround. By utilizing this aggregative reduction, what kind of scale could the author actually simulate?
Using this specific aggregative constraint, Pajo was able to run multi-agent simulations, estimating the CKI for networks, scaled all the way up to 100,000 independent actors.
From a roadblock at 50 actors up to 100,000. That's incredible. When you run a simulation with 100,000 independent nodes, what does the MRI actually show us? What are the large end findings of this model?
The findings are highly revealing, and they exhibit remarkable stability as the network scales up. Across the large N simulation runs, the price of anarchy consistently settles in a tight band around 1.18 to 1.98.
Okay, and if we invert that ratio to find our alignment score, that translates to a CKI of roughly 0.84.
Right. The system is operating at about 84% of its socially optimal efficiency. But the most critical insight isn't just that final score. It is found by examining the specific adoption rates, the K values that generate that score.
We need to look at how many people actually chose the circular scenic highway versus the linear toll road.
Exactly. In the Nash equilibrium, representing the selfish, decentralized reality of the simulation, the adoption rate of the circular route settled at approximately 15 to 16%.
This 15%.
Only about 15% of the actors in the network found it privately rational and economically viable to absorb the trust costs and the congestion penalty.
Wow.
But when the algorithm calculated the social optimum, the omniscient central planner minimizing the total societal cost, including the leakage externalities, the optimal adoption rate required from the network was roughly 45%.
The gap between those two numbers is staggering. The decentralized, self-interested system naturally stagnates at 15% adoption, but what is mathematically best for the collective society is 45% adoption.
That is a 30-point chasm of pure systemic underadoption.
It means nearly a third of the entire network should be recycling for the greater good of society, but they are actively choosing not to.
Because the private trust costs and the congestion penalties make it economically punishing for them as individuals.
They are taking the toll road because the highway is fundamentally broken.
Exactly. That 30-point gap is the very definition of the structural misalignment the CKI is designed to capture. But there is a second, arguably more provocative insight hidden in that data. Notice the ceiling of the social optimum.
I was looking at that. The omniscient, perfect central planner only demanded a 45% adoption rate.
It did not demand 100%.
Why? If we have a magical central planner who cares deeply about the environmental externalities of plastic leakage, why wouldn't they force 100% circularity? Isn't the ultimate goal of sustainability zero waste?
Not within the constraints of this economic model, and perhaps not in physical reality either, primarily due to the nonlinear scaling of the congestion factor.
The bottleneck gets worse.
Remember, as more material is forced through the circular route, the marginal processing costs escalate. Even a perfect central planner, one who fully internalizes and penalizes the environmental devastation of a landfill, eventually hits a mathematical inflection point.
The point of diminishing returns.
Exactly. At a certain threshold, the sheer logistical friction, the energy required for transport, and the compounding congestion of attempting to recover and process that final, difficult 10% of highly degraded material.
It actually becomes more expensive.
It becomes more resource-intensive for society than simply allowing it to safely enter a managed landfill.
That is a deeply uncomfortable truth for sustainability advocates. The mathematics suggests that the ultimate goal might not be absolute 100% recovery. The optimal goal is finding the precise equilibrium point where the environmental benefit of circularity is finally outweighed by the logistical friction and energy costs of processing it.
It's a pragmatic constraint.
But this aggregative reduction shortcut that gave us these insights, there is a catch to it, isn't there?
There is a massive structural limitation to the shortcut. The aggregative reduction only holds true if the actors in the network are truly, functionally interchangeable. It only works if I genuinely only care about the aggregate number K.
But real-world supply chains are rarely aggregative. They're highly specific, geographically constrained, and deeply relational.
Exactly. If I am a manufacturer sourcing recycled PET plastic, I do not just care that someone somewhere in the network is recycling.
Right. I need to know that my specific supplier, a known aggregator with a specific purity standard, is providing the material.
My trust costs are deeply tied to local relationships, historic contracts, specific geographic transport routes.
And multi-commodity flows where the price of recovered paper might suddenly impact the logistics of glass and plastic.
So the moment I care specifically about who my trading partner is, the aggregative shortcut shatters. We lose the simple variable K.
And we are violently thrown right back into the 562 trillion combinations for just 50 people. Classical computers fail all over again.
For realistic, non-aggregative, hyper-relational networks, classical computing hits that PPAD complete brick wall. And this is exactly where the paper gestures toward the frontier of quantum computing.
To eventually scale a highly complex, geographically specific CKI model, researchers will likely need to rely on quantum algorithms.
The authors specifically named several theoretical frameworks, including QNASH and QAOA.
QAOA stands for the Quantum Approximate Optimization Algorithm, right?
Yes, and OMMWU, Optimistic Matrix Multiplicative Weight Updates.
How does a quantum algorithm actually bypass the 562 trillion combinations? I mean, it doesn't just calculate faster, right? It calculates differently.
Completely differently. Classical computers evaluate those 562 trillion combinations sequentially, one after another, even if they do it very, very fast.
Right.
Quantum algorithms leverage superposition and entanglement. In theory, an algorithm like QAOA can map the entire topology of the supply chain's cost landscape simultaneously.
Wow.
It doesn't evaluate every single point one by one. It explores the probability space of the entire landscape at once, using quantum interference to amplify the probability of finding the optimal Nash equilibrium or social optimum,
while canceling out the probabilities of suboptimal configurations. So we are essentially waiting on the quantum supercomputers of tomorrow to fully solve the trash problems of today.
These quantum approaches are currently largely theoretical, or limited to very small, highly controlled proofs of concept on today's noisy, intermediate-scale quantum hardware.
But they represent the necessary mathematical lifeline if we ever want to scale this diagnostic MRI tool to fully map the hyper-complex, localized realities of a globalized supply chain.
Precisely.
But the beauty of this research is that we do not have to wait for quantum supremacy to start applying this theoretical framework right now. To understand why those specific trading partners, local geographies, and deep trust costs matter so immensely, we need to leave the theoretical quantum realm.
We need to look at a real-world network.
A network that operates on cash, sweat, physical handshakes, and incredible daily human ingenuity. Let's examine the Philippine informal economy.
This section of the paper really grounds the high-level mathematics in a vivid, tangible, and often grueling reality. Pajo applies the CKI framework directly to the waste recovery network in the Philippines, specifically focusing the lens on the informal sector.
And the scale of this informal network is staggering.
We are analyzing a distributed workforce of roughly 1.3 million individual actors.
1.3 million distinct nodes in our game theory model. Walk us through the demographics of this network. Who exactly are the people handling these materials?
Drawing on extensive market studies and ethnographic data, the paper segments this population into three main groups. At the base level, you have approximately 1.1 million sari-sari stores.
Sari stores.
Yes. These are ubiquitous hyperlocal neighborhood convenience stores. They are often operated out of the front window of someone's home, deeply embedded in the social fabric of the community.
And they serve as the backbone of retail distribution in the Philippines.
Absolutely. Next, you have an estimated 175,000 informal waste pickers, locally known as manggagalaco.
The people doing the actual gathering?
These are the individuals actively navigating the streets, residential bins, and municipal dump sites on foot, or with customized pushcarts, performing the intense physical labor of recovering materials.
And then who buys it from them?
Finally, you have around 50,000 junk shops and repair shops. These act as the vital aggregation nodes, buying the sorted materials from the pickers and consolidating them for larger industrial recyclers.
So we have 1.3 million people manually routing the physical materials of the economy. What specific materials are flowing through this massive informal web?
It is a highly complex, multi-commodity flow. You have peat bottles, which actually retain quite a bit of economic value.
Like the sparkling water bottle we talked about at the start.
Exactly. In dense urban centers, PET is widely collected because the profit margin justifies the effort. However, the model highlights significant leakage of PET in more remote or island geographies.
Because the localized trust costs and the literal physical transportation costs completely wipe out the profit margin for the picker.
Exactly. Metals, like aluminum and copper, are highly prized and relatively well recovered because the market incentives naturally align with the physical effort required. But the most catastrophic material flow highlighted in the paper is the proliferation of sachets.
Sachets. The single-use, multi-layered plastic packets. Everything from shampoo and laundry detergent to instant coffee and condiments.
The sachet economy, often referred to as the tingy culture, is driven by the economic necessity of affordability. Low-income consumers buy in micro quantities because they cannot afford the upfront cost of bulk packaging.
And an estimated 60 billion of these sachets are consumed annually in the Philippines.
60 billion. And from a circularity standpoint, they are a nightmare. They are incredibly difficult to recycle mechanically because they consist of multiple thin layers of different plastics bonded with aluminum foil.
Plus, they're frequently contaminated with residual food, oils, or soap.
Most critically, because they weigh virtually nothing and require intense processing, they hold almost zero economic value to an informal waste picker. They represent a massive systemic source of leakage straight into the environment, clogging waterways and drainage systems.
So we have 1.3 million independent, rational actors dealing with tens of billions of pieces of extremely low-value, high-friction material. To understand how broken this system is, the author attempts a Fermi estimate of the CKI for this specific informal network.
A Fermi estimate being a technique for making an educated, back-of-the-envelope calculation based on rough orders of magnitude and dimensional analysis.
Right, so it isn't a precise decimal point measurement, but it gets you in the correct conceptual ballpark. What does the Fermi estimate reveal about the CKI for the Philippine informal economy?
The Fermi estimation places the CKI alignment score in the vicinity of 0.3.
Point 3. If we tie that back to the price of anarchy math we did earlier, a score of 0.3 means the entire system is operating at roughly 30% of its socially optimal efficiency.
That is a massive, severe misalignment.
But what does a 0.3 actually feel like on the ground? Why is the score so profoundly low?
A score of 0.3 means that for the overwhelming majority of transactions, the individual incentives dictate that actors default to the linear toll road route 0.
They burn the sachets, they dump the low-value plastics in the river, or they abandon them in open lots, specifically because the scenic highway of circularity is completely impassable.
And the paper argues this impassability is driven heavily by the crushing weight of trust costs. In the Philippine informal sector, trust costs are not abstract mathematical variables. They are grueling, daily physical and psychological realities.
I imagine trust costs in this environment aren't just about, filling out paperwork. Think about the physical reality of a waste picker hauling a massive, overloaded pushcart through the heat and traffic of Manila.
It's exhausting just to picture.
They finally arrive at the local junk shop with a massive sack of mixed plastics. The trust cost is the fact that they don't have a formalized, legally binding contract with that shop owner.
Right, there is no safety net.
If the shop owner arbitrarily claims the plastics are contaminated with water to artificially increase the weight and docks their pay by 20%, the picker has absolutely zero legal recourse. That fear and the intense vigilance required to negotiate every single transaction has to be a measurable economic anchor.
You are describing the exact friction the model captures. The trust cost is the painstaking manual verification process. The shop owner must visually inspect, sort, and weigh the material, constantly suspicious of adulteration.
Like sand mixed into aluminum cans or water sprayed on corrugated cardboard?
Exactly. Because there is no formal quality assurance framework, this intense negotiation happens in real time every single time a transaction occurs. Furthermore, as the informal economy attempts to digitize, transitioning away from physical cash to digital wallets like Gcash, an entirely new layer of trust costs emerges.
Digital friction.
Yes. The friction of verifying digital payments on cheap, cracked smartphones in bright sunlight. The anxiety of ensuring the cellular network isn't down in a crowded market.
Or the risk of accepting informal credit or delayed payments because the junk shop owner hasn't been paid by the larger aggregator yet. Every ounce of this friction eats directly into the already razor-thin profit margins of choosing the circular route.
The sheer exhaustion of having to prove you aren't scamming each other, combined with the manual labor of guaranteeing every transaction, simply makes it easier and more economically rational for many actors to just burn the zero-value sachets and move on.
The overwhelming trust costs are actively destroying the Nash equilibrium.
The friction dictates the behavior. And this is where the mathematical model allows us to run a fascinating, highly targeted simulation. The author asks a theoretical question. What happens if we could magically intervene, not with physical infrastructure, but by reducing those relational trust costs?
Okay, I love this part. In the model, Peugeot simulates a hypothetical scenario where the base trust cost for every actor in the network is reduced by a flat 40%.
Let's assume that reduction comes through a widely adopted, perfectly standardized digital ledger that guarantees quality.
Or a wildly successful government ID and payment program that instantly secures funds without fees. What happens to the alignment score?
Under those optimistic parameters, a 40% reduction in trust costs pushes the Fermi estimate of the CKI up from 0.3 to roughly 0.55.
That is a staggering jump. By simply paving the potholes of trust and verification on the scenic highway, you nearly double the systemic efficiency of the network without necessarily building a single new physical recycling plant or buying a single new garbage truck.
The simulation mathematically proves that organizational, digital, and relational interventions can be just as powerful, if not more so, than pure physical infrastructure investments.
But this realization brings us to a highly sensitive and critical section of the paper, the impartial game theoretic analysis of actual existing policy implications.
Yes, the author applies the CKI lens to major Philippine environmental policies, specifically RA 9003, the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act, and the more recent RA 10298, the Extended Producer Responsibility Act, or EPR.
Extended producer responsibility. The core concept is that the massive multinational corporations who manufacture and profit from the plastic packaging are legally required to fund the recovery and cleanup of that plastic.
On its face, holding producers accountable sounds like a necessary positive step.
It does. The stated intention of EPR legislation is inherently logical. These policies generally attempt to clean up and fund the waste ecosystem by mandating formal certifications.
They create registered, audited lists of authorized recyclers and processors. They require rigorous, verifiable paper trails and digital ledgers to absolutely prove that a specific ton of plastic was actually recovered from the environment before a corporation can claim a compliance credit.
The goal is transparency and formalization.
However, When you run these compliance mechanisms through the CKI model, it generates a deeply counterintuitive, mathematically impartial hypothesis about the actual outcome on the ground.
I think I see where the math is leading us here, the irony of formalization. By demanding rigorous paper trails and expensive audits to ensure compliance, the policy is accidentally raising the barriers to entry, which exponentially increases the trust costs for the informal people at the very bottom of the pyramid.
The paper hypothesizes that policies demanding strict, rigid formalization can inadvertently create what the author terms sanctuary zones.
Entry
The
zones.
sanctuary zone is a privileged, highly protected economic space inside the regulatory boundary. Within this zone, compliant, fully formalized actors like large corporate material recovery facilities, licensed logistics haulers, and multinational aggregators enjoy subsidies, direct EPR payouts, tax incentives, and reduced regulatory scrutiny.
But to gain entry into this lucrative sanctuary zone, an actor must overcome massive administrative and financial hurdles, costly licensing, digital reporting infrastructure, formal tax compliance.
Hurdles that an informal street-level waste picker simply cannot jump over.
So the policy designed to save the system ends up fracturing it. The government attempts to regulate the flow with strict certifications, but in doing so, they drastically raise the trust costs for the 1.3 million informal workers who are actively handling the physical materials in the dirt and the streets.
If the informal waste picker is excluded from the financial benefits of the sanctuary zone because they can't afford a formalized business license, their private cost of attempting circularity goes through the roof.
And the CKI model predicts that as their margins collapse, they will rationally default back to the linear route. The EPR policy, explicitly designed to increase recycling rates, might effectively push more plastic into the ocean simply by economically marginalizing the essential on-the-ground workforce.
It is a profound structural irony, and it perfectly illustrates exactly why a diagnostic, incentive-based metric like the CKI is so vital. It is critical to state clearly that the research is not taking a political stance here.
Right. The paper is not arguing that EPR laws are inherently malicious or that environmental regulation is inherently flawed.
No, it is simply impartially running the math on the resulting incentive structures. The finding is that if a policy draws a regulatory boundary that effectively excludes the vast majority of the human actors actually handling the material flow, the systemic alignment, the CKI score will inevitably plummet, regardless of the noble intentions behind the legislation.
The mathematics suggest that effective policy design in these environments must actively focus on lowering the trust costs for the informal actors, finding ways to integrate them and compensate them within the system, rather than imposing rigid compliance burdens that effectively banish them.
That concept of a sanctuary zone is incredibly evocative. The actors inside the boundary reap the benefits and the subsidies, while the actors outside the boundary are forced to bear the externalities and the physical labor.
But the paper doesn't just leave this as a quirk of recycling policy. Pajot takes a massive conceptual and cultural leap in the final section. He argues that this dynamic of exclusion touches on an ancient, deeply rooted human concept of belonging.
And this connects us directly to the very name of the index itself, Kahampatan.
Yes, this is where the paper transcends rigorous algorithmic mathematics and enters the realm of profound indigenous philosophy. To understand the synthesis, we have to look at the author's prior research.
In 2025, Pajo published extensive ethnographic and conceptual work studying the Ambala Aita. This is an indigenous group located in the Bataan province of the Philippines.
And through this fieldwork, he documented and analyzed their central concept of Kalapatan. The closest English translation of Kalapatan is a state of deep, holistic, relational well-being.
Relational well-being. So it's not a westernized concept of individual happiness or personal wealth. It is entirely dependent on the health, balance, and reciprocity of the connections between the people in the community and their connection to the environment.
Precisely the distinction. Pajo situates Kamatan within a much broader, deeply ingrained ontology of Filipino flourishing. This cultural framework includes concepts like bagani, which translates to martial valor or immense courage in the face of adversity.
It includes bayani, which represents moral sacrifice, heroism, or putting the needs of the community above oneself.
And it encompasses bayanihan, the widely recognized Filipino concept of communal unity, collective aid, and cooperation. It's often visually represented by the historic practice of an entire village physically carrying a neighbor's house on their shoulders to move it to a safer location.
The ethnographic literature suggests that these specific actions, courage, selfless sacrifice, and collective coordinated effort, are the necessary causal pathways that allow a community to achieve a state of kahampatan.
The philosophy is beautiful, but how does the author connect the concept of a village carrying a house to algorithmic game theory and the logistics of plastic recycling?
The connection bridges the theoretical math of the sanctuary zone with global cultural anthropology. The author examines how the concept of the sanctuary zone, the protected space, has linguistic and cultural parallels in the civilizations around the world.
He notes that across wildly different cultures, the specific word used to denote a sacred, spiritually protected space is frequently the exact same word used to describe a zone of social privilege, legal immunity, or economic exclusion.
Give me a concrete example of that linguistic overlap.
The paper provides several. In the ancient Celtic tradition, the word nematon designates a sacred grove of trees, a place of spiritual communion. But a nematon was also a strictly defined zone of legal inviolability, a sanctuary where a person could not be arrested or harmed, conferring immense privilege to those allowed inside.
We see a similar dual meaning in the Polynesian concept of tapu, which is the etymological root of the English word taboo. Tapu combines a sacred spiritual prohibition with a state of being set apart, restricted, or socially privileged.
And in the Arabic tradition, the word haram refers simultaneously to a forbidden, sacred precinct, such as the inviolable area surrounding the Kaaba in Mecca, and the specific protected privacy and privileges extended to a personal household.
Across vast stretches of human history, societies draw invisible lines. Inside the line is the sanctuary, the sacred, the protected, the privileged. Outside the line is the profane, the unprotected, the marginalized.
So if we bring that ancient sociology back to our supply chains, when a modern government drafts a recycling policy that requires a highly expensive formal business license, digital tax compliance, and automated sorting machines just to receive an EPR subsidy for plastic, they are drawing a modern nematon.
They're drawing a tapu line in the economy.
They are engineering a modern sanctuary zone. The licensed, well-capitalized corporations are safely inside the sanctuary receiving the subsidies. The 1.3 million informal waste pickers are left outside in the profane space, bearing the physical burden and the environmental externalities.
That is the brilliant, unifying synthesis of the entire paper. The mathematics and the culture perfectly mirror each other. What does a CKI score of a perfect 1.0 actually signify?
Mathematically, it means the price of anarchy has been reduced to 1.
It means the system is entirely devoid of friction, and the decentralized, self-interested choices of every single individual perfectly align with the optimal, sustainable good of the entire collective.
But philosophically, socially, a CKI of 1.0 is the exact mathematical expression of Kahampatan.
We started this deep dive looking at a formula designed to track the routing of discarded water bottles, and we have arrived at an indigenous philosophy of holistic human flourishing.
It proves that a supply chain is not just trucks and warehouses. At its core, a supply chain is just a materialized network of human relationships. A CKI score of 1.0 means that the sanctuary zone has been deliberately expanded to include absolutely everyone.
It means the economic system has been engineered so that the rules of the game naturally foster relational well-being. It reframes the entire concept of sustainability.
It is no longer just a logistical chore of counting plastic polymers. It becomes a moral imperative to align our incentives so that taking care of each other and taking care of the environment is the easiest, most economically logical choice for every single person in the network, regardless of their status.
It is a profound reframing of how we approach systemic design. And the implications of this diagnostic framework extend far beyond the circular economy of waste.
In the concluding thoughts of the paper, the author briefly explores an analogy in the realm of energy governance.
Consider how we currently manage and incentivize modern power grids. Governments frequently implement policies like net metering, where affluent homeowners who can afford to install rooftop solar panels can sell their excess power back to the grid at retail rates.
Or we offer massive tax incentives to large industrial factories that achieve complex ISO energy efficiency certifications.
Those policies operate exactly like the EPR recycling laws. They are creating energy sanctuary zones.
The underlying dynamics are identical. The individuals and corporations who have the capital to afford solar panels or the administrative bandwidth to secure ISO certifications are granted access to the privileges, the tax breaks, and the subsidies inside the sanctuary zone.
And the fixed costs of maintaining the physical grid are often quietly, regressively passed on to the lower-income ratepayers who are locked outside that zone because they rent their apartments or cannot afford the upfront capital costs.
The regulatory boundary creates severe economic misalignment. The author posits that researchers could develop an energy CKI to diagnose this exact dynamic in power grids.
To mathematically measure if the financial incentives we are directing toward a few certified actors are actively destabilizing the broader grid or imposing fundamentally unfair trust costs on the collective.
The underlying mathematics of Kahampitan, the precise measurement of the alignment between the individual part and the holistic whole, is universally applicable to the architecture of any complex human system.
This has been an incredibly dense, multi-layered, and deeply rewarding journey through the material.
Let us weave all of these threads together to recap the core insights for everyone listening. We started by identifying the diagnostic gap, the realization that our existing descriptive metrics like the product-focused MCI and the macroeconomic CMU tell us that our recycling systems are failing, but they are entirely incapable of telling us why.
We learned that to uncover the why, we have to map the incentives using algorithmic game theory. We utilize the price of anarchy to expose how rational, localized, self-interested choices inevitably lead to massive systemic inefficiency and environmental leakage when there is a lack of coordination.
From that baseline, we explored the specific, granular frictions driving those selfish choices. The grueling trust costs of verification, risk, and manual labor inherent in an informal economy, paired with the congestion factor of limited processing capacity.
We saw how attempting to simulate these intersecting forces on a large scale triggers a combinatorial explosion, requiring either clever mathematical constraints, like the aggregative reduction, or the future probabilistic power of quantum computing algorithms, like QAOA, to fully map complex relational supply chains.
We then grounded all of that high-level math in the bustling, complex reality of the Philippine informal economy. We learned that an estimated CKI score of zero point 0.3 represents 1.3 million people trapped in a rigid architecture where overwhelming trust costs force them to rationally abandon circularity.
We explored the deeply impartial realization that well-intentioned environmental policies can accidentally worsen the crisis by engineering exclusive sanctuary zones that lock out the informal workforce.
And finally, we tied the entire mathematical framework to the Ambala Ida philosophy of Kampatan, demonstrating that a perfectly aligned, zero-waste supply chain is, at its essence, a state of profound relational well-being.
The research serves as a powerful quantitative reminder that our economic models, our algorithms, and our deepest cultural values are not isolated spheres. They are inextricably linked and constantly influencing each other. The mathematics of the CKI is ultimately a mirror, reflecting the structural health of our human relationships.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. A way to take this grand global game theory and apply it to the microscopic realities of your everyday life. Think about your own environment, your workplace, your neighborhood association, or even the dynamics within your own family. How much of the daily friction and systemic inefficiency you experience, the collaborative projects that continuously fail, the community initiatives that stall out, the endless arguments over shared responsibilities in a household, how much of that dysfunction isn't a failure of technology or a lack of resources or even a lack of good intentions, but is simply a bad Nash equilibrium? What is the specific trust cost, the fear of being taken advantage of, the lack of transparent communication, the tedious unspoken bureaucracy that is actively preventing you and your community from reaching your own social optimum? The mathematics we explored today prove that a better system is possible, that a CKI of 1.0 is theoretically within reach. But the math also proves that the system will not fix itself. It is entirely up to us to do the hard relational work of lowering the toll, paving the potholes of trust, and actively expanding the sanctuary zone so that everyone has a chance to thrive.